أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباءهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم 2 فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها هبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم انفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون. ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون. قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أحد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لتمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نؤمهره ننخس في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
بر محمد وآل محمد صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना, ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना, ये करबला है, ये करबला है। ये बात हरगिज़ ना भूल जाना, ये करबला है, ये करबला है। और जहाँ में सब्र और रिज़ा यही है,
خدائے صبر و رضا یہی ہے، یہاں پہ آتے ہیں چل کے مہدی، بہشتے زہرا یہ سرزمی ہے، یہاں ہے زہرا کا آنا جانا، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے۔ اور دعائیں دیں گے حسین تم کو، یہاں پہ آنسو اگر بہائے، جہاں پہ بیٹی نے بے وطن کی ستم گروں سے تماچے کھائے، یہاں پہ خوشیوں کو بھول جانا، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے۔ اور یہاں پہ گزری ہے وہ قیامت، ملا نہ اس کو سکون اب تک، ردائے چننے کے غم میں عابد لحد میں روتا ہے خون اب تک، یہاں پہ ہرگز نہ مسکرانا، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے۔ اور یہیں پہ قاسم ہوئے ہیں ٹکڑے، یہیں پہ زی سے گرے تھے مولا، یہی سکینہ سمو سے لپٹی، ارے یہیں پہ اصغر نے تیر کھایا، یہی غریبی کا ہے ٹھکانہ، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے۔ کسی کے دل میں لگی ہے برچھی، کسی کے بازو کٹے یہیں پر، ہائے علی کی بیٹی کے کتنے یوسف لہو میں ڈوبے ہیں اس زمین پر، لٹا ہے سادات کا گھرانہ، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے، یہ کربلا ہے۔ اور رہے کہیں بھی جہاں میں جا کر حسین والے یہ جانتے ہیں، ہے ہم اہل ماتم کے دل تکلم یہاں کی مٹی سے ہی بنے ہیں، ارے یہاں ہے واپس، یہاں ہے واپس पलट के आना, हरे यहाँ है वापस पलट के आना। ये करबला है, ये करबला है, ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना, ये करबला है, ये करबला है। पर मोहम्मद व आलि मोहम्मद सलवात। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्ली अला मोहम्मद व आलि मोहम्मद।
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। अम्मा युजीबुल मुस्तर्र इज़ा दआ व यक्शिफुस्सूअ। 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 अल्लाहुम्मा इन्ना नस्अलुका व नदऊक باسمك العظيم الأعظم الأعز الأجل الأكرم يا الله 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 يا محمود بحق محمد، يا عالي بحق علي، يا فاطر بحق فاطمة، يا محسن بحق الحسن، يا قديم الإحسان بحق الحسين. انصر شيعة الحسين يا الله، انصر شيعة المؤمنين يا الله. اللهم اكشف هذه الغمة عن هذه الأمة يا الله، اقضي حوائج شيعة الحسين يا الله، شافي وعافي المرضى من شيعة الحسين يا الله. اللهم اقض حوائج المؤمنين يا الله، آمن شيعة الحسين في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها يا الله. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج، واجعلنا من شيعته وأنصاره وأعوانه والمستشهدين بين يديه. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آله في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة، وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه ربك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم أرنا الطلعة الرشيدة والغرة الحميدة، واكحل أنظارنا بنظرة منا إليك. اللهم نقسم عليك بالزهراء فاطمة إلا ما جعلتنا من شيعة الزهراء ورزقتنا شفاعة الزهراء يا الله يا الله يا الله، لقضاء الحوائج ولشفاء المرضى ولكشف هذه الغمة عن هذه الأمة ولتعجيل فرج مولانا صاحب العصر والزمان، وإلى أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات، لا سيما أرواح أموات شهداء البحرين والشهداء من المؤمنين والمؤمنات. رحم الله من يقرأ السورة المباركة الفاتحة مع الصلوات.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد وقد قال الله في كتابه الحكيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألا له الخلق والأمر تبارك الله رب العالمين آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بذكرنا لاستشهاد السيدة زهراء سلام الله عليها. May Allah increase in our reward for the commemoration of the martyrdom of Bibi Fatima to Zahra salam Allah alayha. Before we begin our discussion properly, there's always some curiosity about the munasabat of the 13th of this month of Jumad al-Ula, and the discussion around whether this is the particular day that we commemorate or is it another day. First and foremost, there are three sets of dates that are discussed. And the interesting part of these dates is that while no particular day in specific is mentioned, time periods are mentioned. The first narration, for example, says that the Shahadat of Sayyidah Zahra is 40 days after the death of the Holy Prophet. The second riwayah that we are commemorating now says it is 75 days after the death of the Holy Prophet. And the third set of narrations indicates that it's 95 days after the Holy Prophet's death. When it comes to the dates that we commemorate, when we look at the 13th of Jumad al-Ula and we say that this is the day that we'll commemorate, it's actually an ihtimal, a possibility. Rather, what you'll find is that in much of the Muslim world, that three dates, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, are all commemorated. The significance of this being that when we look at the narration, we see that the narration of the Shahadat of Sayyidah Zahra says 75 days after the Shahadat of the Holy Prophet. If we were to calculate that the 28th of Safar was the date of the Shahadat of the Holy Prophet, then we would say that 75 days thereafter, 2 months is 60 days, plus 13 and the 2 from the Safar, we would say the 13th of Jumad al-Ula, clear. However, there is the ambiguity of the lunar calendar that's involved as well too. That as we follow a lunar calendar, we don't know that the year of her Shahadat, did the months of Rabi al-Awwal and Rabi al-Thani have 29 days or 30 days? So traditionally what has happened is that we commemorate on all three of the days, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, as we don't know how many days were in the lunar calendar month in the year of her Shahadat. So for example, if Rabi al-Awwal had 29 days, and we need to collect 75 days after the Shahadat of Rasulullah, the date of the Shahadat of Bibi Fatima would be the 14th of Jumad al-Ula. Or if both Rabi al-Awwal and Rabi al-Akhir had 29 days as opposed to 30 days, we would say that the date of the Shahadat 75 days after the death of the Holy Prophet would be the 15th of Jumad al-Ula. Therefore, according to these dates and this information that we have of the calculation of 75 days after the death of the Holy Prophet, and our inability to determine exactly how many days were in the month of Rabi al-Awwal and Rabi al-Thani in that year, it has become a tradition that while the 13th of Jumad al-Ula starts this period of commemoration, traditionally it is valid and correct that we should hold majlis and we should commemorate on any and all of these 3 days, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. And the same can be applied for the narrations around the 95th, 95 days after the Shahadat of Rasulullah. As such, we find and we understand that the 13th is the start of this mourning period, and this is part of the mourning period as well too, within which we may hold our majalis and commemorations for our dear beloved lady, Sayyidah Zahra, salamullahi alayha. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We take a look and we see, as we begin our discussion, that Allah mentions in Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 54, Allah says, "Ala lahul khalqu wal amru, tabarakallahu rabbul alameen." That surely His is the creation and the command. His is the realm of the creation, alimul khalq, wal amr, and the command. Tabarakallahu rabbul alameen. Glory be to Allah. Blessed is Allah, Lord of the worlds. This verse brings us back to a reality and understanding that Allah is the master of both that which we can see and that which we cannot see. We've previously discussed that everything that our five senses interact with is known as alim al-khalq, or the realm of creation. And that when our five senses interact with the environment and whatever they can be made aware of is what is created by Allah's command. And we look at this as the kingdom of Allah, that everything that we see is created by Allah. However, the might and the glory of Allah is not limited to our senses and what we can see, but rather we also acknowledge that there is that realm that Allah has created which is outside of the control of our five senses, and that realm is known as Alim al-Amr. This Alim al-Amr and this realm of and the kingdom of what Allah has commanded to come into existence is that which He has not given us the authority to see or interact with, but rather it still bears an impact on our life and on our actions and behavior, and that it impacts what we receive as reward, and also it will impact how we are punished. The understanding of this points us to the fact that we must be aware and cognizant of both that which is from the created realm and Alim al-Khalq, and that which is outside of our five senses, which is Alim al-Amr. Traditionally, it's very straightforward that man of his intellect pays attention to Alim al-Khalq, pays attention to the food that he eats, pays attention to the clothes that he wears, the jobs that he performs, the time that he spends, and what his behavior brings him as benefit or as loss. Here are points that we typically pay attention to, are very well aware of and familiar with, and that we find that in our society, it is well mastered and discussed of how we should pay attention to these items and make sure that our actions are reflective of success in these realms. Now, what many times becomes ignored is that Alim al-Amr, or the realm of the spirit, or the realm of that which is unseen. Within this Alim al-Amr, or environment or kingdom of Allah that is from His command, one of the direct places that we need to pay attention to and focus upon is our spirit. And Allah Himself describes in the Quran in Surah Al-Isra, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, when the people, they ask you about the soul, قُلْ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, say that the soul is from the command of Allah, وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا, and we have not given you any knowledge about it except for a little. Here Allah is telling us of the impact of Alim al-Amr in our lives, that our very spirit with which we are born is something that exists, that Allah has brought into creation and exists in Alim al-Amr and the world and His creation of command, and that within this there is very little knowledge that we have except that which Allah has given to us. The soul and the spirit is something that people are always interested in learning about and knowing about, and its role in society varies from time period to time period. Historically, in the time of the Holy Prophet, and still to some element today, the spiritual realm was often blamed for anything that could not be explained. For example, a difficulty suddenly befell you, it was blamed upon a spiritual difficulty that had befallen you. Even till today, many times it'll happen that someone goes through a difficulty, and the first thing that we blame is not the fact that I made bad decisions or not the fact that I made a mistake in my calculation, but rather that someone has infected me with the evil eye, or that someone is doing black magic upon me. We forget the consequences of action and behavior, and we suddenly assume that everything is happening because of what befalls in a spiritual realm that is outside of my control. There was nothing I could do about it. And even in this day and age, the curiosity about the soul still continues. And there are elements within society who are now, as the intellect continues to grow, deciding that we need to address the spirit and come up with a system to discuss and talk about the spirit, whether correctly or incorrectly. There's even influences on our children about the idea of the spirit, and to give them an influence and suggestion to either downplay or limit the role of the spiritual involvement in our day-to-day activities. Take, for example, something that many households with children right now are familiar with is the new Disney movie that came out about souls. I think it's called Soul. This whole conversation about igniting the imagination to discuss and to defer the impact of something that we cannot directly feel and to pacify the masses by the discussion around this topic is something as a consequence that we know this exists, but we don't know how to deal with it. Our goal, and inshallah this opens up a door of discussion that inshallah in our next discussion around Fatemah we'll talk about the impact of utilizing imagination and the faculties of man, and the discussion around how this is involved in our day-to-day life and how we need to deal with this. But our discussion today is around this concept of the soul and understanding that our spiritual presence is something that requires attention. In this, we take a look that our spirit is involved in all of our decision-making processes and impacted by our decision-making process. When we discuss the soul and we acknowledge it's one of the parts of existence that Allah has created and presented before us, we have to pay attention to how this soul is impacted by our decisions. The relationship between soul and body is one where they both are working together to produce results and consequences. There are times where the spirit enacts upon the body and times where the body enacts upon the spirit. A successful human being, therefore, is one who, in his decision-making process about life, takes into consideration both the physical impact and the spiritual impact, and makes decision on the basis of both of these together. The awareness and acknowledgement that Allah has created and given us a soul is not sufficient. It requires now that we have come to the acknowledgement that the soul is from the command of Allah and the creation of Allah, that while we cannot see or we cannot touch or smell this soul that's present within us, it still is a factor that needs to be accounted for in our decision-making process. And Allah has taught us that the ignorance of the soul can have negative impacts on your decision-making process. Let's discuss a few examples to understand this. The spiritual presence within a human being must be acknowledged when making decisions, or there can be consequences to it. The example of this, one example of this, is the concept of the food that we eat in terms of halal and haram. You see, the piece of beef that's placed before you, or chicken or lamb or whatever it happens to be that you desire at that moment, the physical presence of that item doesn't change whether it's halal or haram. The weight of the meat, the physical attributes of the meat can be identical. But the difference comes in that one is permissible for you to consume and the other is impermissible for you to consume. The reality of the presence of both of these items, that if we were to place them in front of an indifferent third party, other than maybe a psychological factor that they have a preference to one over the other, or they have a bias towards one over the other, we would see that for the most part, the physical element does not change. We cannot justify the idea that we only eat halal food because of the physical impact between the differences of the two meats. Some people do. They come forward and they say that, yes, we prefer halal because, well, the blood is drained, therefore it is a healthier meat. We see the treatment of the animal as being better. Well, then I can recreate and replicate all of these items in the haram meat. I can slaughter it identically. I can raise it identically. What's the significance of it being halal? The significance of it being halal is the spiritual element that is present within what I consume and put into my body. That the nourishment of my body requires not simply the nutrients and nutritional information that is associated with the product, but rather its harmony with my spiritual presence is also impacted. This is why we have narrations that tell us that one who consumes haram meat, for 40 days his prayers are not accepted until his body has been cleansed. Here Allah is telling us that take into account and consideration your spiritual presence when making decisions about what you put in your body. We see narrations of our ulama and discussions about our ulama that say that in the interest of preserving spiritual purity and spiritual harmony with the body, that they would take extra caution and care about the food that they consumed, such that it would not disturb their spiritual presence. A second example, if we were to take a look, when understanding the impact of spirituality, the impact of the spirit and the body working together, is in the role of marriage. One of the consequences of marriage is making halal the relationships between men and women. And the permissibility of taking someone who is na-mahram, who is not mahram to you, meaning not permissible for you to touch, and making them permissible to touch. However, when we look at the physicality of the nature of this contract of marriage, when marriage is performed and recited, there's no physical change that comes between the two. See, for example, when you have, a Wi-Fi router and you have a device, I can't see the connection between the two, but when I link them and I add my device to my Wi-Fi router, just as a hasbil mithal, as an example, that there is an aspect that changes that I can see. I can see that the name of this device is now connected to my router, and I can feel the impact of this action. That somewhere there is a change that happens, that physically within a list now, these two devices are known as attached. And while I may not be able to physically see it immediately, I can always go back and I can check and see that, yes, in this list is included all of those items that are connected. Marriage produces no such result. There's no physical consequence, no list somewhere that exists that shows and updates as these connections are made or broken. Marriage has no physical change that comes about between the two spouses. Their physicality remains the same. However, now all of a sudden something has changed between these two people that makes them permissible. That those few words that are spoken, they are spoken into the air. Their presence is completely dismissed. It's absent once they are said. But the spiritual impact that these words play, the spiritual impact that this act and contract between two parties that exists, presents us with the reality that there is something in the spiritual aspect of these people that has changed and now brought an impact to their physical presence. That has made something that was haram before, now halal. The difference, again, between marriage and no marriage, that adultery and a relationship in marriage, that these two, physically, there's no difference between them. However, spiritually, there's a great impact that Allah says, for one, that if you man tazawwaja faqad ahraza nisfa dinah, that one who gets married has certainly protected half of his faith. That it has an impact in your faith and facilitates the access to the rewards of Allah. That the sleep of a married person is greater than the night spent in worship of the single person. A great spiritual change takes place in this individual by the acknowledgement and accomplishment of marriage. Versus the absence of this same marriage can become the source of divine punishment and difficulty. That we can see that in akhirah there comes a change, and that even in some of my material dealings I can see change. When we're so ready that all of a sudden someone has given me the evil eye, which is why I am going through difficulty or why I'm going through problems, we don't take into consideration that the actions and the sins that I commit, they have a physical aspect to them as well too. But they do. These actions have a consequence to them. As a third example, we see, for example, that the difference between one who is innocent by themselves, they can be impacted by the negative spiritual decisions of others. Look at a child. A child can either be born as waldul halal, meaning that from a permissible relationship, or waldul zina, or that which is born from adultery. If you weigh the two children, they'll weigh the same. You'd bring them to the same classrooms, they'll behave the same. However, spiritually, something has been impacted by the decision made by the parents. The consequence of ignorance of one's spirit can not only impact my own relationships, my own desires, but that of my generations and of what comes after me. And that I can limit the aspect of my generations based upon the negative consequences of my own spiritual decisions. A child who is born of adultery, for example, has no right to attain the level, or should not be someone who leads people in prayers or becomes a mujtahid. Or, for example, even worse than this is that it's known that anyone who was responsible for the killing of a ma'soom did not have this ability except that they were born of adultery. Our Imam alayhi salam goes so far as to explain that when Nabi Musa came before Fir'aun and presented the religion of Allah to Fir'aun, and Fir'aun turned to his advisors and said, "What do you advise me to do?" The advisor said, "Kill him now. Kill him now. End his speech now. Finish this now. Be done with it." And Fir'aun refused to kill Musa alayhi salam. The A'immah explain, the advice of the wazir was on the basis that he was from impure birth, that he saw it possible for a person to take the ability to kill the representative of Allah on this earth. But Fir'aun himself could not bring himself to bring the action to pass because he was not from illegitimate birth. The significance of these examples, whether we take a look at the halal and haram food, the adultery or marriage, or the birth from someone from a marital relationship or from an adulterous relationship, all speak to great points of visibility of the impact of considering and knowing about the spirit and paying attention to the impact of the spirit in this world. That which is created by Allah, whether we can sense it or we cannot, has an impact and impacts our reality on a regular basis. Our goal as both parents and individuals and members of society is that in our decision-making process, we should always consider the spiritual impact that our actions have. Our association of the spirit to the material world and its impact is something that when we look at from even the narrations of our Holy Prophet, we see the association of the spirit in our actions. A man comes to our Holy Prophet, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, and brings to him the question that he says, I intended to have this supposed prophet of Allah busy for hours. I asked him, O Prophet of Allah, tell me about everything that is good and everything that is bad. He imagined that the Prophet would now be set into motion of dictating lengthy materials and actions that, for example, have many caveats and exceptions and explanations and lists and books and books and books of material, now that this Prophet would have to explain. But the reply from the Prophet in a simple term was, he points to the chest of the man and he says, everything that your heart accepts is good, and everything upon which your heart hesitates is bad. The awareness of our spirit and our body increases with our actions and has greater influence over us, which Allah Himself points to in Surah Shams. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. When Allah describes and the soul and the one who created it and taught it right from wrong, فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, and He taught it everything that is a source of its destruction and of its piety, that the soul possesses this knowledge, that within ourselves the soul is aware and involved in our decision-making process, and if we purify it, that we will be successful. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, that certainly successful is the one who purifies this soul, protects this soul, preserves it in his decision-making process, ensures that its value is associated with his actions and that it is considered when he makes decisions. وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا, and certainly the loser is the one who corrupts this soul, ignores its impact, doesn't get involved in this process of making sure that his soul works correctly. These verses and these discussions all point to the aspect that while you should not judge all of your decisions simply on their material impact of what is beneficial and what is negative, rather take into consideration what happens to my spirit by the decisions that I make. That my spiritual sensitivity and my spiritual awareness should be considered in every decision to ensure that the spirit is preserved and protected and purified. And that when I start bringing my spirit into the conversation of my decision-making process, that then I can attain purification, sanctity, and success. Look at the conversation again that's in Surah Al-Insan, the 76th surah of the Holy Quran, where we see the conversation where it begins in verse number 7. يُوفُونَ بِالنَّظْرِ وَيُخَافُونَ يَوْمٌ كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَتِيرًا, that they fulfill their vows and fear a day, the evil of which shall be spreading far and wide. This points to the concept of fulfilling a vow, not because of the physical consequence that will come to me, the presence that I see that if I don't fulfill this vow, then someone will punish me today, or that something will be taken away from me today, but rather the vow, the ahad that we keep, or the nadhr that we keep, is for the consequence of the day that will come forward where both our spirit and body will be punished. And it continues, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شُكُورًا. That verse 8 and 9 of this surah are describing how the Ahlulbayt made their decisions. That they fed, they gave their food out of love for Allah to the poor, the orphan, and the captive, which relates back to the famous story when Bibi Fatima and Amir al-Mu'mineen keep an ahad, a nadhr, to fast for 3 days if Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain are cured from sickness. And upon the completion, when they fasted the first day, a poor person came and they gave their food away to him. A second day, an orphan came, they gave their food away to him. The third day, a captive who had been freed came to their door and they gave their food away to this person. They didn't make these decisions because that they felt that they were full and that they had lots of food, but rather they forewent the material and physical benefits because of the spiritual consequence that they were in search of. And it shows that their intention of giving away their food was not physical benefit, but the spiritual benefit when they make the statement, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ, certainly we are feeding you, لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ, for Allah's sake, لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شُكُورًا, we don't want from you neither reward nor thanks. That the physical benefits that you would give us in compensation of this food are not a factor in our decision, but rather the spiritual satisfaction and the spiritual need that we possess for Allah is why we make this decision. That becomes our ideal, that when we start considering the spirit as part of our decision-making process, that we will become like these Ahlulbayt, and that spiritual goal that we will possess will make us prefer the spiritual factor and the benefit with Allah, the unseen, rather than the material benefits that we can achieve. Which brings us to our final point in our conversation, is the role of Bibi Fatima as a spiritual role model. That whether we look at this story where Bibi Fatima, as the mother of the house, is creating an environment where she prefers the spiritual satisfaction with Allah over the material satisfaction, and by doing so, educates and teaches her children to follow this example. Or we see her hours and nights spent in worship and ibadat of Allah, and preferring the presence with Allah than in the material satisfaction of dunya, in which we see the famous narration of her teaching the importance of spiritual education when Imam Hassan says, "Why don't you pray for us, O mother?" The question here is about the benefit for the self. The physical benefit that one can attain by asking Allah, and the education given by Bibi Fatima, Ajar thumma dar, that you always pray for others where there is no benefit for you, but there is the spiritual satisfaction with Allah before you ask for yourself and what your desires are. How is it possible that a woman who only lived 18 years in this world is someone who we commemorate till today, is someone whose memory lives on and is commemorated not once a year, but 3 times a year? It's because of her spiritual presence that she created with Allah and the spiritual priority that she gave to Allah, not the material benefit. One of the questions that's often asked is why? Why did Bibi Fatima seek her own garden of Fadak if her desire was for the akhirah and for the spiritual completion and satisfaction with Allah? Why did this Sayyidah give such a powerful speech? Khutbatul Zahra, the speech of Sayyidah Zahra, is one of the most perfect and eloquent speeches made in the history of this world and one of the most elucidated, impactful statements ever presented. It was presented for a piece of material. It was presented for a piece of land and wealth. That lady who was willing to go hungry for 3 days for the sake of Allah couldn't withstand, na'uzu billah, some financial difficulty, so she went searching for her wealth? No. Had that been the case, her mention and her presence may have been something that Allah did not preserve. But rather we see that her seeking for the garden of Fadak was in the interest of promoting the wilayat of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. As such, Sayyidah Zahra is the first martyr for the sake of imamat, is the first defender of the sake of imamat. The proof of this comes from her own masayib and oppression. When it's written that Sayyidah Fatima went to the door of her house to diffuse the situation, they had made hujum on the bayt of Sayyidah Zahra. They had collected in mass, and they would rattle their swords and shields to make noise that would be frightful to those who were present in the house. In this situation, this lady went to the door with the interest of saying that, have you no shame? This is the house of the daughter of your Prophet, the one who brought you Islam and gave you the guidance, who taught you the religion of Allah and how to attain the satisfaction of Allah. Now, after his death, you turn your attention to his daughter? You turn your attention to this door? And while in the first few times that the people had become embarrassed and ashamed that they had come to the house of that whom was beloved to the Holy Prophet, they turned away and they left. But eventually there came a time when their leader commanded them to pile the firewood in front of this door. And Zahra called out, "This is the house of the daughter of Rasulullah. She is present in this house. Will you still attack this house?" And when the people turned and they said, "We are embarrassed to that Fatima is in this house, shall we burn it?" The answer that came, "Walau. So what if Fatima is in this house? So what if the daughter of Rasulullah is present in this house? So what if that personality who, when Rasulullah would see her, would stand up from his place, kiss her and seat her in his place? So what if the one who the Prophet said that when I miss the scent of heaven, I smell Fatima, was present in this house? It was concluded that burn down this house, even if Fatima should be present. When they attacked this door, it said that a cry came out from behind the door. And instead of this cry of Zahra, being something that would stop the oppressor. It in turn enraged them further that they said, we pushed harder to where the feet of Zahra were lifted from the ground as she was pressed between the wall and the door. That the same Zahra, because of this pressing between the wall and the door, her ribs were broken. Her Muhsin was made shaheed. She was left on the floor of her burning house in a condition where she bled from Muhsin. That they said in this condition, when Ali came to the door and broke the ranks of the enemy on the door, that they took Ali in ropes around his neck and his hands and began to drag him through the streets of Medina. That here shows the impact of the spirit of Zahra. That Imam Hassan narrates, my mother immediately forgot her own condition and came into the streets after my father Ali ibn Abi Talib, seeking to protect the remainder of the Messenger of Allah on this earth and the Imam of the people. Zahra came after Imam Ali without regard to her own difficulty. She forgot her pain and acknowledged the pain of Imam Ali, where they said that when Ali was dragged and Zahra came behind her, Qunfud turned with his whip and struck Zahra to an extent where Fatima to Zahra in the streets of Medina, where her father had been the leader of humanity, called out and said, I am now beseeching you not to release Ali, but to stop beating me in the streets of Medina. The difficulty on Ahlulbayt at that time was so difficult that when Amir al-Mu'mineen was dragged to take bay'ah, that Fatima to Zahra eventually raised her hands in dua, and she insisted that if you now do not release Ali, I will make dua against you. They said that when the hands of Zahra went up for this dua, the walls of the houses of Medina were lifted so high that a camel could have passed under them. In this moment, Amir al-Mu'mineen, foregoing all else, called to Salman, Salman, tell Zahra, if she makes this dua, then Allah shall destroy these people. He will destroy all of these people who had come into the faith of Islam and were the ones who your father spent his life trying to provide guidance to. Salman went and told Sayyidah Zahra that this dua would destroy these people, in which they released Amir al-Mu'mineen and he returned. An exchange takes place at this point, and then we are completed with the Masa'ib as well. It said that as they returned, Amir al-Mu'mineen turns to Sayyidah Zahra and he says to her, Oh Zahra, are you okay? Sayyidah Zahra, with her wounds, remember they had broken her ribs, they had killed her Muhsin, the hand of the Maloon had struck through the cloth of the hijab of Zahra at her face in such a way that her eye was damaged until the day she died. Her earrings had been broken in her ear. But these effects did not impact Zahra. The importance of the wilayah of Ali impacted her, where she says, Oh Ali, if you are okay, then Zahra is okay. Oh Zahra, from these wounds, your time on this earth was such that Imam Sadiq says, when you left this earth, your skin had become so pale that you did not have the strength to walk anymore by the time that you left this world. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون ندعوك باسمك العظيم الأعظم الأعز الأجل الأكرم يا الله 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 بحق فاطمة وأبيها وبعلها وبنيها والسر المستودع فيها. Oh Allah, by the right of Zahra, her father, her husband, her children, and the secrets from Fatima to Zahra, oh Allah, forgive our sins, cover our flaws. Oh Allah, protect our children on the upright path of Ali Muhammad. Oh Allah, protect us from the sickness and diseases that are in this earth. Ya Allah, give shafa'ah to the mu'mineen wherever they are. Ya Allah, we have come to you with hajat. By the mention of Sayyidah Zahra, fulfill our hajat. Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Sahib al-Zaman. Make us from the upright supporters of Sahib al-Zaman and entitle us to the Shafa'a of Imam al-Hussain in dunya and in akhirah. رحم الله من يقرأ سورة الفاتحة مع الصلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
خواب میں زہرا نے بابا کو جو دیکھا ایک شب، خوش ہوئی پاس میں بابا کے چلی جاؤں گی اب، ہائے رونے لگی بچوں کا خیال آ گیا جب، یہ خبر ہی نہ ہوئی پاس حسین آ گئے کب، اماں ڈھونڈیں گے کہاں یاد اگر آئیں گی، ہم تو مر جائیں گے گر چلی جائیں گے۔ ماں نے جب یہ سنا دل تڑپنے لگا، پیار کرتے ہوئے فاطمہ نے کہا، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین۔ ماں کسی کی ہمیشہ رہی ہے کبھی، میں بھی بچھڑی تھی اماں سے بچپن میں ہی، ماں کے جانے کا دکھ تو بہت تھا مگر دیکھو میں بھی تو بن ماں کے جیتی رہی، تم کو میری قسم تم سے بچھڑے جو ہم، ضبط کرنا ہے لال ماں کا یہ غم، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین۔ حال میں نے کسی کو سنایا نہیں، خود تو روئی علی کو بتایا نہیں، میرا پہلو شکستہ ہے بس اس لیے اپنے سینے سے تجھ کو لگایا نہیں، ٹوٹی ہے بس لیا کرنا پائی بنا، کتنی تکلیف میں جی رہی ہے یہ ماں، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین۔ مجھ کو معلوم ہے میرے نور نظر پیاس لگتی ہے تم کو بہت رات بھر، پیاس سہنے کی عادت بھی ڈالو ذرا، پیاسا رہنا پڑے کب کہاں کیا خبر، پیاس تم کو لگے اور نہ پانی ملے، یہ دعا ہے کہ وہ دن نہ آئے کبھی، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین دیکھو حسین، اے میرے دل میرے چین میرے حسین، نہ پریشان ہو ماں بھی ہے یہی، دیکھو مرنے کی اب بات کرنا نہیں، موت سے پہلے ہم مر نہ جائیں کہیں، تم ہو دنیا میں تم سے ہے زندگی، تم کو دیکھوں تو چلتی ہے سانسیں میری، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین، ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین، ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین، تم کو کھانا بھی فضا کھلائے گی، اور سویرے وہی منہ دھلائے گی، اب تم جہاں جاؤ گے ساتھ جائے گی وہ، ساتھ ماں کی طرح وہ نبھائے گی، اب پالے گی اب وہ، ضد نہ کرنا کوئی، خوش رہو گے تو ماں کو بھی ہوگی خوشی، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین، ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین، ایسے نہیں کہتے، دن وہ آیا کہ جب چل بسی فاطمہ، ماں کی میت پہ شبیر نے دی صدا، تم بلاؤ گے تو پاس آؤں گا میں، ٹوٹے بندے کفن فاطمہ نے کہا، آجا اے میری تجھ پہ قربان ماں، جب حسین آ کے لپٹے تو بولی یہ ماں، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین، ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین میرے حسین، ایسے نہیں کہتے، دیکھو حسین، اے رضا رضی شان دل تھام لو، رو کے شبیر کہتے تھے اماں سنو، دیکھو تم نے بلایا تو میں آ گیا، جب بلاؤں گا آؤ گی وعدہ کرو، ماں نے وعدہ کیا بیٹا چپ ہو گیا، جب جنازہ اٹھا پھر نہ آئی صدا، میرے حسین۔
السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا نبي الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا سيد الوصيين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين أيها الشهيد بكربلاء، السلام على 9 المعصومين من ذريتك، علي بن الحسين زين العابدين، ومحمد بن علي الباقر، وجعفر بن محمد الصادق، وموسى بن جعفر الكاظم، وعلي بن موسى الرضا، ومحمد بن علي التقي الجواد، وعلي بن محمد النقي الهادي، والحسن بن علي العسكري. السلام عليك يا صاحب العصر والأمر والزمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان. الأمان 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 من فتنة الزمان. عجل الله تعالى فرجك، وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك، وجعلنا من أنصارك وأعوانك، ورحمة الله وبركاته.